Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics, continuing our series on the fundamentals of marksmanship. We're going to talk about sight picture and sight alignment. If you're just catching up with the series, this is the third video, and we're going through the fundamentals of marksmanship as I apply them, kind of my personal philosophy. I'm sure you've seen the fundamentals explained before. Sometimes there's 6 of them, sometimes there's 7 of them. And again, my application of the fundamentals mean they have to apply to the range and to real world, not to just one or the other, because the two things need to be as synonymous as possible. I'm a self-defense focused instructor, which means my application of the fundamentals of marksmanship are self-defense focused. What that means is I'm not going to isolate something for practice on the range, because my range practice is for self-defense purposes. And again, there's a lot of artificialities that go into that, so I got to make things as realistic as possible, understanding that some things just can't be replicated safely or at all as they might occur in real life, because self-defense is almost 100% unpredictable. Anything can happen, but there is a most likely to least likely. But that's getting into a separate topic. We've already covered grip and stance. In this video, we're going to talk about sight picture, sight alignment as they apply as a fundamental of marksmanship. This is probably one of the most easy fundamentals to explain, but the most difficult fundamental to master, because just the physiological nature of human beings and the psychological nature of impatience, timing, and situation context. What sight picture, sight alignment is. Those two terms exist mainly from the use of iron sights as firearms evolved. It's really hard to go back in time and definitively find out who put sights on guns first. Some say it was the Janissaries. That's getting into a bit of a history lesson there, but the basic idea is I'm going to use an object or objects on the firearm itself in order to align and shoot exactly where I want to shoot. The amount of time and the behavior of what I'm shooting at is going to affect my accuracy, but so am I. I'm a very big believer in shooting being as natural as possible. I mean, think about it, it is a little bit unnatural, be it rifle or handgun or shotgun, what have you, to shoot in a natural way, because there's things we have to do with firearms that we wouldn't necessarily otherwise do with any other thing. In the history of warfare, I won't say modern warfare, I say warfare in general, from the first weapon that was created, we tended to focus on the threat. And that's kind of the way physiologically that we want to focus. When our sympathetic nervous system activates, your fight, flight, or your body alarm, or whatever term you use, you want to stay focused on the threat, because guns have only existed for 500 years, a little bit more than that. Whereas we've been fighting without guns for, depending on who you talk to, 300,000–400,000 years since the first weapons became a thing. Bows, arrows, rock sticks, depends on how far back you want to go, but I guess you'd stay target focused. You had to use your bare hands too. With iron sights being the first way that we shot, well, the second way that we shot firearms, because the very first firearms didn't have sights, we focused on the firearm itself. And that creates physiological issues with shooting. That's why sometimes you hear about somebody who's had a self-defense shooting, they say they didn't see their sights. Now, the argument in the shooting community has always been, did they not see them, or did they just not remember seeing them? I think that's kind of getting into an academic aspect of it. I believe that you should practice to focus on front sights for most situations if you're using iron sights, rifle or handgun. But you should also have an understanding of how much work your eye-hand coordination is doing for you to give you that sight picture and sight alignment. In shooting, we tend to not talk much about natural eye-hand coordination and what it's able to get done for us. If I pick up a rock and I throw it to somebody and they're paying attention to me, or maybe even not, maybe if they're just slightly aware of my presence, it's not helpful to do this with random strangers. They tend to get really upset. But in an environment where you know the person, even if they don't catch it, they're going to come really, really close. And that demonstrates their spatial awareness, their eye-hand coordination, their proprioception, all these other physiological attributes that sometimes when we shoot, we just ignore it exist. Why would I want to ignore these concepts and these principles and these physiological facts when it comes to shooting? Just say, all right, well, put the front sight between the rear notch, and you want to align them, and then you want to focus on that front sight. Or if we're using a red dot sight, we want to superimpose the red dot while staying target focused over our desired point of impact, which is physiologically the best way to shoot. It also removes 2 focal planes that you no longer have to negotiate with as you're shooting. Sometimes we just want to pretend like these other things don't help us as much as they actually do. If you've tried shooting a red dot handgun, or you do shoot a red dot handgun, and I talk about the handgun specifically, you probably have become intimately aware of how effective or ineffective your eye-hand coordination is in helping you acquire your dot for the purposes of shooting. You can't cheat and I don't want to say cheat, but you can't rely on the sighting systems being on the same horizontal plane to guide you to a proper sight alignment to a sight picture. With the red dot, your eye-hand coordination, you're bringing your hands in relation not only to your ocular alignment to the gun, but your gun's alignment to the target is how you're going to acquire your dot. Once you get your eye-hand coordination kind of honed, if you will, you definitely start to appreciate and develop a separate skill set for that you can take back to iron sights and become more proficient, more faster on iron sights themselves. When it comes to the actual philosophy, the fundamental of marksmanship that is sight picture and sight alignment, what we're talking about is applying a method of knowledgeable aiming regardless of situation. So if I'm using my firearm to shoot a target at 3 yards or a target at 25 yards, the sight picture and sight alignment is going to remain the same concept. My sight alignment for iron sights is that equal light, equal height, as you've heard it described. I want the front sight to not be elevated or depressed inside that notch, and I want there to be equal distances between the front sight post when looking at the rear notch, and I want to stay front sight focused. Some people will shoot with a soft focus. You'll see competition shooters where they talk about looking through their sights. And I also apply another, and this is not something I created, it's something I picked up along the way, but I will also use my sight picture as an actual reference bracket, especially as distance increases. If I'm shooting at a body-sized target from 25 yards away, I can, again, we're dealing with a front sight post here, and if you've shot at 25 yards, you know just how little of the target you can actually see, especially once you go to front sight focus. I will correct the alignment, if you will, the alignment of the firearm itself off of the outside of the sights. How much of that sight picture fits between the shoulders of my ideal presentation. A little more problematic when we shoot on 3D targets with an oblique or a flank presentation, but still very possible to factor in, regardless of the target size, is the sight picture in the middle of the target before I even worry about aligning the sights and then going to front sight focus. And then at that point, all I have to worry about is elevation. When I use a red dot, it's a lot simpler. I stay target focused, I put the dot everywhere I want to hit, and if I do everything correctly with my grip, and I don't let my trigger finger disturb my grip, which we'll get to in a future video, I'm going to get the hit that I want. Discipline and understanding are the two biggest, I think, aspects of sight picture and sight alignment. We're talking about iron sights. Do I knowledgeably know, because I practice it, what less than ideal sight alignment will actually get me on the target? If my sight's slightly to the right, or my front sight slightly to the right, slightly to the left, slightly high, slightly low, or some combination thereof, am I going to miss the target at the distance I'm shooting from? Am I going to hit the target but not quite where I wanted it to? Or can I really not tell a difference in where my round actually struck versus where I was aiming, even though the alignment wasn't quite right? With red dots, this is no different. If my target's floating a little bit low and right, and again, on a red dot, especially on a handgun, it tends to exaggerate that natural movement. When I look through a red dot handgun with a smaller dot, like a .325 or even a 1 MOA, I seem to have a lot of just natural trimmer movement. That movement is still there on iron sights. You don't notice it, one, because the size of the dot relative to the size of a front sight post, two, because the dot floats independently of the firearm itself. This is the same as true as rifles, and three, unlike iron sights with a red dot, I can see all the way around my point of aim. Iron sights, I can't see underneath my front sight post. My front sight post is fixed to the object that's moving, and I'm aligning it with the rear of the object that's moving. As that moves, you don't get to translate, or you don't see the exaggeration, I should say, of that natural movement that's present in all shooting. The last critical aspect that I'll talk about, really the last critical aspect, is do you understand your sight picture? And I don't mean do you understand round placement, because that's important. High thoracic, cranial vault, good places to shoot someone to incapacitate them if you have to. But have you, be it iron sights on a handgun or a rifle, or red dot on a handgun and a rifle, actually seen what you're actually aiming at? In practice, this is complicated because targets are always targets. You can set up no-shoot targets, but they're not very realistic. And even those photorealistic targets aren't very realistic. I see them sometimes where they'll have like a photo of a guy with a gun, and they're like, oh, this is realistic. I'm like, no, it's not, because the guy's not actually that big. They make the picture smaller. And of course, the argument, I've talked about this before, is they're like, well, that just simulates him being further away. And I'm like, oh, really? Have you shot a 300-meter simulated target on a 25-meter range? How hard was that? Now go do the real thing. There's a difference of application, not only of ballistics, but of understanding and discipline with our sight picture and sight alignment. What I'm specifically talking about is, do you actually have the knowledge necessary to pull the trigger to use lethal force? This has always been a problem when we talk about environmental concerns. What's your sight picture, sight alignment skill set look like in adverse lighting? in twilight or mesopic lighting, in darkness or scotopic lighting? How well are you able to knowledgeably get the data you need before you go to front sight focus? Are you staying target focused with your red dot? Are you gathering the data necessary to actually pull the trigger in the moment? Because not all shootings are spontaneous. It's super cool to, draw and get that one round on target in 1 second. I would call that in most situations, and again, spontaneous self-defense situations do happen, I'd call that a late ID on the threat. You were task-oriented in something else and you didn't process the situation as it was occurring. And again, the possibility of having a spontaneous threat is still there. They do happen. But some people dwell in the spontaneous shooting training and they don't focus on the judgment shooting. I can still have my 3-yard, 1 second shoot, but maybe a situation develops over 10, 15, 25 seconds. An argument. You try to de-escalate, de-escalation doesn't work, then the sight picture sight alignment comes into play. Lighting conditions can affect what your perception is. Your personal biases can affect what your perception is. You combine those two bad things into sight picture sight alignment and you may get a bad shoot. This gets into the procedural or the scenario-based training aspect of things, but these are very real possibilities. There's a thing known as cognitive interpolation, which is a fancy way of saying my brain is a pessimist. My brain assumes something based on the circumstances, my biases, my personal training, my personal beliefs, all these other psychological, physiological factors, and then makes a decision for me. That's why when you're walking through a field and you see a snake out of the corner of your eye, you react to that. And when you actually look at it, you see that it's a stick. The reason we do that is in our reptilian brain programming, if you will. The people who didn't do that, their DNA didn't get passed on because it was a snake. They ignored it. They got bit. That's why you see a coat rack out of the corner of your eye, you think it's a person. You see a reflection in the mirror, you think it's a bad guy. Your brain is filling in the information, thinking worst case scenario, because to assume the alternative could get you hurt. Now you may wonder why I would bring up this type of psychological, physiological behavior for something like sight picture sight alignment. And again, I told you, self-defense focus instructor. Part of sight picture and sight alignment is accurate understanding of the target you're about to shoot at. That happens during sight alignment, arguably. I need to recognize that it is in fact a threat, and I need to take available time, if time is available, to assess the situation. Now, if it's an honest mistake, it's an honest mistake. But sometimes we have the ability to process and we don't. Or sometimes we react based on deep structure programming that's precognitive and out of our control. It's an amygdala response. It's almost like a startle, but not quite. We just act. Because our brain says emergency and it hits the reaction button and something will occur. Sometimes it's the wrong thing. In those situations, there's not a lot that we can cognitively do to correct that, but we can account for it in the way that we train in our practice. Varied lighting conditions, varied environments, varied distances. All too often, students will see what they want to shoot at, and they'll press out and they'll go to front sight focus on iron sights, rifle or pistol, and they'll just shoot, and they'll shoot, and they'll shoot, and they'll shoot. At what point are you assessing your performance? They say don't look over your sights. And to a large degree, I would agree with that, but that's more of a marksmanship isolation for skill development. If you're practicing for self-defense shooting, you need to be evaluating the situation prior to the first round being fired as time permits, and not taking a pause, not like shoot for and assess or something like that, but you need to be aware of the changes that are occurring. You need to teach yourself to not necessarily come off that front sight if you're using iron sights to stare at the target again, but to be aware of the target. And again, that's very difficult to do with the very unrealistic nature of self-defense practice on ranges. But there's ways that you can do it with a training partner using shoot, don't shoot judgment drills, things of that nature that can help you create a better assessment, the better ability to be spatially aware, situationally aware of your target. The final thing we're going to talk about is the one safety rule that directly kind of addresses this sight picture sight alignment. We talk about be sure it's worded a bunch of different ways, but we're always want to be sure that a backdrop to our target is clear. And I don't know how many times I've seen students shooting fail to do that. I had a driving instructor once for emergency vehicle operations course. Is something you have to go through for law enforcement if you're going to drive a police car, which is a very useful course, and it's usually something that gets addressed really, really well, or hopefully really, really well in the academy, and then it doesn't really get touched on again. But this instructor was a very, very skilled driver. They'd been an amateur racer and all these other things, became a cop, and stayed EVOC because they liked teaching EVOC. They liked driving police cars because, let's be honest, who doesn't? He had a concept called looking deep. And what he was saying is most drivers, and there's a lot of research that kind of backs this up, most drivers aren't looking deep into the lane. They're looking 1 car length or 2 car lengths ahead. Some people are literally staring at the road in front of the car just over the hood, which definitely affects your ability to react to situations as they develop, but also see what's coming and what's after what's coming. If you see someone weaving through traffic when you're driving, you can tell how deep they're looking by how bad or poorly their decisions are made. They're trying to get ahead of everyone, but they'll swerve into a lane and immediately have to slam on their brakes because they didn't see the gap on the other side that they could have threaded. They weren't thinking 2 steps ahead, 3 steps ahead. Looking deep and shooting means seeing your target and what's beyond it. And this is a problem in self-defense shooting because people tend to be tone deaf to that rule, because on ranges they shoot, everybody's online, all the targets are online, there's a berm or a bullet trap or something behind it, and the backdrop is always safe. So it creates a cognitive bias for the background of a target. When I teach my classes, I introduce scenarios, judgment scenarios, where a student is introduced into a situation where they have to recognize which target is a bad guy, which target is a good guy, and there's more than one target. Sometimes there's 8, sometimes there's 10, sometimes there's more. There may be 1, 2, 3 threats. And I'm telling the students either think of that as 3 separate threats or one guy who keeps moving around, which is probably a little bit more likely than 3 threats, even though both of them are possible. And what I find is, and this isn't across the board, but when students have to clear the backdrop to their threat, students with less self-defense focused training or less self-defense focused practice tend to ignore the backdrop completely, only stay threat focused, and if they miss, they hit my no-shoots. Or they'll shoot through my bad guy target because it's lined up with a no-shoot, and they'll hit that target as well. And of course, they're cardboard. So of course the bullet's going to go through both of them. And I have to tell people like, hey, on a real life human being, handgun ammunition isn't as likely to pass through a person as it is cardboard, but it's definitely something you need to be aware of. And you've got to be able to clear, even if it's only a matter of degrees, before you apply your sight picture or your sight alignment to the problem. One of the big reasons that I'm a huge red dot proponent, especially on handguns, but on rifles too, is the fact that I'm staying target focused, so I'm not coming back and losing my fine focus on the environment. I'm still able to look deep while I'm using the optic to shoot accurately. And that's not something you can necessarily do with iron sights, because just based on the way the human eye works, once I go to front sight focus, my background, the further away from the front sight it is, the more blurry it becomes. And if lighting or environment is a concern, it creates even more difficulty with making sure my backdrop is clear, and it takes away from me the ability to look deep. So it's something that you have to consider when you're practicing your sight picture, sight alignment. It's not only about the gun or the isolation or point of aim, point of impact. It's also about how effective are you at using sight picture, sight alignment in not only placing the total package on the desired point of aim, but also factoring in the environment beside, in front, and behind the target. From a ethical or moral or legal or civil standpoint, sight picture, sight alignment is probably the fundamental that most applies right up until the first round is fired in a self-defense situation. It's the last step in most shootings, almost all shootings I would say. There's going to be a chance for sight picture, sight alignment if your physiology, when your sympathetic nervous system activates, allows it to knowledgeably judge the situation for what it is. Because we can only consciously do one thing at a time, or maybe we have a precognitive response and we just go to threat focus right off the bat. It may complicate our ability to process the environment. And people bring up all the time, well, you never know what you're going to do until it happens, and I don't really necessarily disagree. I do disagree with that, I should say. I absolutely disagree with that statement, because if that was the case, why would we train? You'd be training, and they say, well, as soon as anything happens, all this training, we don't know what you're really going to do. And I know some people are talking about, hey, can you actually use force to potentially take a life using lethal force, justified self-defense? Some people come at it from that aspect, which I can kind of understand. But on the other side of it, people train all the time and then do exactly what they're trained to do. We have a whole group of people who do that. They're called the military. Law enforcement is to some degree the same way. Obviously, those are 2 totally different purposes and 2 totally different focuses and 2 totally different qualities of training. The military is able to control its overall quality of training across whatever branch a little bit better than law enforcement is, because they're not all on the same page. You've got departments and budgets and all these other factors that come into it. But if you're not getting something from your unit or your police department or your personal practice, maybe you need to seek outside help or outside understanding to develop a better psychological appreciation of what sight picture, sight alignment is going to do for you, the costs, the benefits, the training that you're going to put into it. Force-on-force training is an excellent litmus test for how effective all your live fire practice and training has been. I'm Eric Allen with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.